Haiti is a tiny nation in the Caribbean, right next to the USA. It shares a small island with the Dominican Republic. It is extremely poor, the poorest in the Western Hemisphere, in fact. The island has been inhabited by people for around 7,000 years, with small farming villages appearing around 5,000 years ago. By the 15th century, between 100,000 and several million indigenous people lived there in large communities. They based their economies on cassava farming, fishing, and trading between islands in gold jewelry, pottery, and other goods. Despite inhabiting the island for thousands of years, though, very little evidence of these people remained following the arrival of Europeans. Near the turn of the 1500s, Christopher Columbus arrived on the island and claimed it on behalf of Spain. He renamed it La Isla Española, later anglicized to Hispaniola. That renaming set the tone for the future. The Spanish wasted no time in replacing the existing indigenous population. They enslaved tens of thousands of indigenous people and forced them into gold mining and other extractive industries under cruel conditions. They also brought with them European diseases, which spread rapidly through the population. Within 2 decades, the indigenous population had collapsed to around 30,000. By the end of the century, they had been virtually wiped out. A genocide. Once the land had been emptied, and there was little more money to be made, many Spanish colonists simply left. Those that remained were mainly concentrated on the eastern end of the island. As the Spanish presence receded, others moved in. By the mid-16th century, French and British pirates had taken control of some islands on the western end of Hispaniola. The location allowed them to raid ships coming to and from the North American colonies. The presence of pirates then attracted European navies. This was the beginning of a transition. Over time, the pirate bases and military presence evolved to permanent settlements. These settlements eventually evolved into plantation colonies. In the 1660s, the French established the Port-de-Paix settlement and handed control to the French West Indies Company. Their economic focus shifted from gold to agriculture, with highly profitable crops like sugar growing well in Haiti's climate. The use of forced labor was expanded, but there weren't many indigenous people left, so enslaved Africans were brought into Haiti in massive numbers. By the late 1600s, around 5,000 had already been brought to the west of the island. This was just the beginning. In 1697, the Treaty of Ryswick made it official. France got official control of the western third of the island through a treaty with Spain at the end of the 17th century. They renamed it Saint-Dominique, and created one of the most intense and violent plantation economies in the world. Back to the video in just a minute. Let's hear from today's sponsor, Proton Mail. Freedom is impossible without privacy, but in the United States, your private emails, texts, and calls might not be so private. Thanks to Section 702 of the FISA Amendment Act, intelligence agencies can collect data on foreign nationals, but there's a backdoor that lets them surveil people in the United States as well. And it's not just the NSA. Federal and even local law enforcement can access personal data from third parties without a warrant. This means that your emails, your texts, and your calls are all vulnerable. That's where Proton Mail comes in. Take control of your privacy by clicking my link in the description box and downloading Proton's free encrypted email service to protect your identity online. Proton is built with privacy at its core. Headquartered in Switzerland, it's protected by some of the world's strongest privacy laws. Laws that make it illegal for Swiss companies to cooperate with foreign surveillance. This means that in principle, no government can force Proton to hand over your emails. And beyond legal protections, Proton uses end-to-end encryption, meaning your emails are locked before they even reach Proton servers. Not even Proton can read them. And it's not just email. Proton Drive, Proton Pass, and Proton Calendar all use zero-access encryption, ensuring your files, passwords, and schedules stay yours and yours alone. In a world where governments and corporations constantly look for ways to access your data, privacy shouldn't be a luxury, it should be the default. Join over 100 million people taking control of their online privacy with Proton. Get started for free using my link, proton.me/Hakeem. Thanks to Proton Mail for the sponsorship. This allows me to pay my editor fairly, which is much appreciated. Alright, back to the video. Over the next century, the colony's population output exploded. Saint-Dominique became France's wealthiest overseas possession, producing sugar, coffee, indigo, cacao, and cotton. By the 1780s, almost 2/3 of all French foreign investments were tied to this one small colony. Ships docked there more than 700 times a year. The colony generated more revenue than all 13 of Britain's North American colonies combined. But all of that wealth came from a single source: enslaved labor.
That expropriation of the third world has been going on for 400 years, brings us to another revelation. Namely, that the third world is not poor. You don't go to poor countries to make money. There are very few poor countries in this world. Only the people are poor. But there's billions to be made there, to be carved out and to be taken. There's been billions for 400 years. These countries are not underdeveloped, they're overexploited.
By 1789, Saint-Dominique had about 550,000 people on it. Roughly 500,000 of them were enslaved Africans, working under horrific and often deadly conditions. Plantation owners failed to prepare food shortages, droughts, or disasters. Enslaved people were expected to grow their own food on their own time, on the margins of steep, eroding land with almost no time to do so. Many did not survive. Some resisted by fleeing into the mountains, where they became known as Maroons, forming communities and waging guerrilla warfare against colonial militias. The natural environment was wrecked by the colonial period. The Spanish had brought in cattle, pigs, and horses, which multiplied across the island, reorganizing its ecosystem. They also mined gold until the small island practically ran out. But the agricultural industry had even worse impacts. Enslaved labor was used to clear forests for fields, especially on steep terrain. That caused massive erosion, dried up rivers, and reduced soil fertility. But the colonial elite didn't care for that long term. After a flood or drought, they just imported more slaves and cleared more farms. It's important to recognize that this is one major reason modern Haiti is so prone to natural disasters. The colony was also deeply divided by skin color and class, broken up along lines of the wealthiest, purest whites at the top and enslaved Africans at the bottom. This division would become the basis for an upcoming revolt. The enslaved people had been always resisting. Likewise, discontent grew from the free colored people, usually a mixed race background, who found it impossible to fit in with the colonial regime and as such allied themselves with slaves. The horrific economic inequality drove even some poor white people to align themselves with the African population. Tensions in Saint-Dominique began to boil over in 1790. Vincent Ogier was a wealthy mixed-race man and a part of the colonial elite. He returned from Paris, where he had lobbied for equal rights for free people of color. Denied, he led a brief uprising that was swiftly crushed. He was captured, tortured, and then executed. This didn't help the tense class and race relations on the island, though. The French revolutionary government had granted limited citizenship rights to rich, free, colored people, but white colonists in Saint-Dominique refused to honor this. Seeing these tensions and worsening economic exploitation resulted in a rebellion of the massive enslaved population. On August 21st, 1791, tens of thousands of enslaved Africans launched an uprising. Within a year, they controlled a third of the colony. 2 years later, the revolution held strong. A representative of the French revolutionary government took a drastic step. Faced with a growing rebellion and in need of manpower, he offered freedom to enslaved people who joined his forces. Later that year, he abolished slavery outright. In 1794, the French government ratified this decision, making France the first European power to legally end slavery in one of its colonies, of course only doing so after being forced to by the resistance of an enslaved population. By 1795, 4 years in, one name had come to the head of the revolution: Toussaint Louverture. A former slave-turned-military strategist, Louverture was widely popular. He earned the trust of black insurgents, free and formerly enslaved, and radical white French people. He built power independently, even negotiating with competing European powers while expanding his control over the island. In 1801, Louverture introduced a new constitution. He declared himself Governor-General for life and abolished slavery across the island, including the eastern Spanish-controlled part of Hispaniola. His vision was not just of a freed people, but of a sovereign and stable state built by those once considered property. This declaration made clear that slavery in Haiti was not ended by France, it was ended by Haiti. The revolution unsurprisingly threatened French imperial interests. It had cut off their most profitable colony and sent a message to others that freedom is possible. In 1802, after the failure of the French Revolution, Napoleon Bonaparte dispatched 43,000 troops to restore control and reinstate slavery. Louverture resisted, eventually agreeing to an armistice, but the French betrayed the deal, capturing him and deporting him to France, where he died in prison in 1803. Even without Louverture, the struggle continued. Jean-Jacques Dessalines, another former slave and military leader, took command. Convinced Napoleon aimed to restore slavery, he mobilized a decisive resistance and succeeded. The French forces suffered a catastrophic defeat at the Battle of Verteret. By January 1st, 1804, Dessalines declared the nation's independence, renaming it as Haiti. The Haitian Revolution, bloody and complex as revolutions tend to be, overthrew the colonial regime, abolished slavery, and established an independent black republic. It succeeded where uprisings elsewhere were crushed or co-opted. It forced the French to abandon their ambitions in the Americas, even leading them to sell Louisiana to the United States. It had freed Haiti from the military forces of France. It was a rupture in the global system of capitalist colonialism. It exposed the deep and disgusting contradictions of Enlightenment Europe, where liberty and human rights were proclaimed, but denied to millions under imperial domination. Haiti emerged not just as a republic, but as a challenge to the racial and economic foundations of that world. At first, the new Haitian Republic was not accepted. Other nations refused to recognize it, rightfully fearing that it would encourage more slave revolts elsewhere. It was the only nation of its kind amongst powers built on slavery. It was politically isolated and left with very few options for trading or diplomacy. Internally, the situation wasn't much better. It was deeply fractured by its complicated history, and civil war broke out just after independence. It was economically crippled by centuries of extraction. Nearly its entire population had been born into slavery and denied the chance to develop any of the skills needed to rebuild society. The colonial infrastructure was built to serve the economic extraction and a select few elites, never to support a developing nation and hundreds of thousands of people. What was there had either been damaged or taken by the French in the war, but external pressure, more than anything, shaped Haiti's future. After more than 2 decades of refusing to recognize Haiti's sovereignty, France eventually agreed to do so, but under one devastating condition. Haiti had to pay financial reparations to the slave owners who had lost slaves, or property, as France saw them, and land during the revolution. They paid for their freedom with their lives, and those that remained would have to pay again in money. It was clearly a ransom, because the threat of another war was the only reason Haiti accepted the deal. The ransom was equivalent to more than $21 billion today, from a brand new nation with no economy or infrastructure. It became known as the double debt. This is because in order to pay off the sum, Haiti was forced to take loans from, conveniently for France, French banks. These banks capitalized on Haitian desperation and charged exorbitant interest rates and fees, which quickly amounted to more than the original ransom. The first installment alone was 6 times the government's annual revenue. Commissions to French bankers alone were more than Haiti could raise in an entire year. This colonial punishment wasn't just about the money France was paid, although that was a big part. It was about breaking Haiti's economy before it had even a chance to grow. Nearly 80% of Haiti's government revenues over the next century were used to service this debt. The result was predictable: crippled infrastructure, underdeveloped institutions, and chronic instability. There was no capital left to circulate inside Haiti, and no money to reinvest in itself. The real cost is impossible to measure. Counting up all payments adjusted for inflation is hard, but doable. What's important though is that you could never account for the lost development and lost revenue from the development the nation could have had if the money was reinvested instead. You can't account for a century spent on the bottom of a predatory global supply chain and what the country could have achieved had it spent the century with proper infrastructure instead. It stunted its growth and development and had compounding effects. France's recognition of Haiti came at the cost of French financial entrenchment in Haitian politics, and it would not be the last power to leverage economic pressure for influence over Haiti, while also preventing it from ever developing as a nation. The first US occupation of Haiti began in 1915 and lasted officially 19 years. On the surface, this was done to prevent other powers from gaining influence. This is already a bad motivation. It explicitly seeks to control Haiti and force them into a close relationship with the US while isolating them from other potential partners. But behind the facade of security and influence, there was another more decisive force at work, which was the economic interests of American finance capital. Loans extended by French bankers had already drained the country through predatory interest, fees, and commissions. American capital saw this and saw an opportunity, lobbying politicians to occupy Haiti, in particular National City Bank, now known as Citigroup. They succeeded. US Marines landed, dissolved Haiti's parliament at gunpoint, and installed a regime that allowed them to control Haiti's finances. From that point forward, Haiti functioned less like a sovereign country and more like a financial asset under external management. One of the occupation's military leaders later described his role openly. "I helped make Haiti and Cuba a decent place for the National City Bank boys to collect revenues." It doesn't really get much clearer than that. For over 30 years, American officers controlled Haitian finances. They spent more money on their own salaries than on public health for the entire nation. Infrastructure investments, clinics, sewage systems were inadequate and more symbolic than functional. The wealth generated from Haiti's labor did not stay within Haiti, of course. It was instead shipped directly to New York banks. A 1918 US supervised election passed a new constitution permitting foreign land ownership, previously banned since the revolution. This legal change aligned precisely with US business interests and opened the door to land acquisition by American firms. Yet most Haitians, particularly rural black farmers, experienced this not as development, but as dispossession. They barely owned anything to begin with. Even symbolic resistance was met with brutal force. Estimates of the dead number in the thousands. Meanwhile, US policy effectively reinstated the dominance of Haiti's mulatto elite. Black Haitians were excluded from government positions and subjected to systemic racial abuses, including forced labor with little to no compensation. The military occupation ended in 1934 under Roosevelt, but direct fiscal control remained until 1941. Yet again, this period left Haiti starved and unable to effectively function, so the US continued to hold massive influence. The foundations of the modern Haitian state, its economic dependency, its political instability, and the marginalization of its rural poor were enforced by this occupation just as they were under France. Haiti became less a neighbor in the Western Hemisphere and more a holding managed by foreign banks and military advisors. Following the official withdrawal of US forces in 1934, Haiti entered what was supposed to be a new phase of self-governance. It wasn't. Globally, Haiti was still completely dominated by the US. It had some domestic self-governance, sure, but the structures implemented under colonial control prevented it from ever becoming truly sovereign. The following decades were marked by instability, punctuated by coups, provisional governments, and deepening inequality. The cycling of US-backed paramilitary terror and dictatorship would extend into the next several decades. The first post-US occupation dictatorship, that of Duvalier, was enthusiastically supported by the US because he was reliably anti-communist and an ally to the US against the USSR. Loans flowed from the West, mostly into his personal account, but on paper for the Haitian people, despite them languishing in poverty regardless. The debts, however, were inherited by successive governments. It's a great arrangement for the US. They bribe a dictator in exchange for his loyalty, but can then demand the money be paid back by his victims once they're free. By the mid-1980s, with Duvalier dead and his son in charge, the situation began to deteriorate. Economic hardships deepened. High unemployment, poor living conditions, and widespread political repression sparked a series of mass protests. In 1986, after a nationwide uprising, he fled Haiti with US assistance. The dictatorship collapsed, but the systems that enabled it remained. The economy still wasn't sufficient, international debt was overwhelming, and international support relied on ideological alignment. The Duvalier period is often remembered for its brutality, but it's equally important to understand that it was a period of calculated external alignment. The West didn't just tolerate the dictatorship, they financed it, enabled it, and benefited from it. It built stability for capital, not for people. In 1990, the election of Jean-Bertrand Aristide marked a historic shift. A left-leaning Catholic priest and advocate for the poor swept into power in what were widely considered the first truly free elections in Haitian history, whatever that counts for. For a brief moment, the possibility of a genuine democratic mandate challenged entrenched power and the extremely small class of wealthy Haitians. But it didn't last. Within 8 months, Aristide was overthrown in a military coup. In response to the military repression, the US imposed trade sanctions, their favorite. But these sanctions, like many before and since, disproportionately hurt Haiti's poor, as they're always intended to do. The underdeveloped economy wasn't self-sufficient and relied massively on aid inflows and trade with the US. The sanctions caused widespread starvation. Thousands fled the country by boat, risking their lives on the open sea. Most were turned away by the US Coast Guard, the same nation that had arranged Duvalier's escape 2 decades ago. By 1994, under international pressure, the military regime stepped down, clearing the way for a second US military occupation. This time it was framed as a mission to restore democracy. Some 20,000 US troops entered the country, the old military was completely disbanded, and a new police force was formed by the US. Aristide was flown back in, but his return was conditional. Under the pressure of the US and international financial institutions, he agreed to implement widely unpopular free market reforms. The reforms were standard for the time: trade liberalization, public sector downsizing, and deregulation. Haiti's economy had been largely agricultural, sustained by small-scale domestic farming, but the influx of subsidized foreign food, especially US rice, quickly wiped out local producers. The very people who had formed the base of Aristide's support, rural farmers, found themselves unable to compete. This wasn't just an economic adjustment, it was a restructuring of Haiti's entire class foundation. The reforms were sold as necessary for modernization, but the outcome was more reliance on foreign aid and worse food insecurity, again to the benefit of American capital. Security, too, remained generally fragile. The new problem was the US-trained police force. It was plagued by corruption and abuses of power, and was not well enough trained or equipped to deal with the type of security issues Haiti faced. Especially in poor urban neighborhoods that had supported Aristide, the second occupation didn't aim to dismantle the structural causes of Haiti's instability. It sought to restore a version of order that was palatable to foreign investors and geopolitical interests. Democracy was acceptable as long as it stayed within certain limits. I'm reminded of a certain song lyric that goes, "From where the only place democracy is acceptable is if America's candidate is electable. I'm from where they overthrow democratic leaders, not for the people, but for the Wall Street Journal readers." Generally, economic reform was non-negotiable. Sovereignty remained conditional for Haiti. This was the lasting impact of the 1994 occupation. A democratic government returned to power, but stripped of its agency, authority, and legitimacy. Haiti got the appearance of national self-determination, but not the substance. After the second US occupation and Aristide's reinstatement, Haiti began a new chapter. In 1995, an ally of Aristide won the presidency, and this was Haiti's first peaceful transition of power since Columbus arrived. It was some progress, I guess, but overdue. Things weren't that simple though. The new presidency faced political gridlock, and in 1999, he dissolved parliament in a massive power grab. A year later, his supporters gained control of the legislature, and Aristide was re-elected president. That election, however, was faced with allegations of fraud. The international response was, again, sanctions. The most vulnerable were the most impacted. Again. Haiti, having been structurally weakened by liberalization and the gutting of its rural economy, now faced escalating social pressures, even more unemployment, even more hunger, even more disease. Aristide's second term began in 2001, but Haiti's situation didn't improve. The economy was in shambles following sanctions, disease, especially AIDS and HIV, were widespread, and violence, political and criminal, increased. Protests broke out again in 2003, challenging both governance and living conditions. When Haiti marked its bicentennial of its independence in 2004, people took to the streets, not in joy, but in protest. By February 2004, Aristide was ousted again, this time through a combination of domestic rebellion and foreign withdrawal of support. The United States and France once again played a decisive role. In the absence of state institutions capable of providing stability, the international community graciously stepped in. The United Nations deployed the United Nations Stabilization Mission in Haiti, led by Brazil and backed by the US. But there were quick reports of systematic and widespread human rights abuses. Forces were accused of committing atrocities, particularly in neighborhoods loyal to Aristide. Those areas, densely populated, impoverished, and frequently politically active, were labeled gangs and treated as enemy zones. The international missions claimed to support democracy, yet acted decisively against the country's most disenfranchised. Meanwhile, Haiti's agriculture, once the primary employer, remained shattered. Free market policies made local food production non-competitive. The economy became centered on remittances from abroad instead. The basic ability to feed the population was outsourced. This whole time, stretching back decades and even centuries, Haiti isn't making enough money to pay its debt down. New loans are being created to pay back old loans, and the debt is only ever increasing. Interest payments choke the economy, which is still paying back loans that have been given to the Duvalier dictatorship. It's impossible to ignore the broader pattern. The US could not tolerate the possibility of an independent Haiti, so close to its borders, pursuing a political and economic path outside of its influence, much like Cuba did. When that influence was challenged, intervention followed. Yet when crises erupted as a result of this external interference, responsibility disappeared, magically. The contradiction is stark. The US intervenes in Haitian politics with ease, but denies culpability for the conditions those interventions produce. From 1994 onwards, and even further back, Haiti was governed by an unrelenting set of external pressures, military, economic, and political. Economic policy was not shaped by Haitian interests, but by what was deemed acceptable to Washington, Paris, or the IMF. This brings us to modern-day Haiti. In the span of just over a decade, Haiti was hit by a series of catastrophes that would have overwhelmed any state. But in Haiti, they were made far worse by the instability and lack of infrastructure. In 2008, 4 hurricanes struck in rapid succession, killing nearly 800 people and displacing hundreds of thousands. Entire harvests were lost. Infrastructure collapsed. But the real devastation came in January 2010 when a magnitude 7 earthquake struck near the capital. Estimates go as high as 300,000 people killed. More than 1 million were left homeless. The earthquakes didn't just flatten buildings, it dismantled what little central state Haiti had left. The national palace, parliament, and major ministries were physically destroyed. An international aid effort followed. Roughly $9 billion was pledged, but the way that aid was distributed is revealing. Only 1% of the money reached the Haitian government. Instead, the majority went to UN agencies, foreign NGOs, and private contractors, largely based in the global north. Haiti's sovereignty was bypassed in favor of foreign intermediaries. These organizations operated above accountability, absorbing resources and administrative overhead and inefficiency. This allowed the image of charity, while in reality, money was just being moved around the global north's administrative sector. Then came cholera. 9 months after the earthquake, UN peacekeepers accidentally introduced the disease into Haiti's water supply. Thousands died, and still, no accountability followed. When Hurricane Sandy struck in 2012, killing dozens and wiping out much of the country's southern crops, the cycle repeated. Destruction, external aid, and continued exclusion of Haitian institutions. Haiti isn't simply a failed state. It is a state whose failures have been manufactured systematically and deliberately through foreign intervention, economic dependency, and elite complicity. Haiti's crisis is not just political or humanitarian, it's economic. The country runs a chronic trade deficit, with more than 2/3 of external trade conducted with the US. Unequal exchange ensures that Haiti exports low-value goods, mostly textiles, while importing high-cost finished products. This creates a net loss of resources and labor, known as unequal exchange. This results in a structural dependency. Local industries collapse under the weight of foreign competition, and rural livelihoods disappear. This dependency extends into finance. After the 2010 earthquake, Haiti's debt was briefly forgiven, but new loans like the $140 million IMF package quickly reimposed the same chains. By 2021, Haiti's debt was back to $5 billion, nearly 30% of GDP. Meanwhile, foreign corporations, primarily from the US and Canada, extract an estimated $20 billion in mineral resources, yet this wealth never cycles back into the country. By being constantly in debt, it's rendered into a cash cow for finance-rich nations like the US. Its population are forced to work for incredibly low wages just to subsist, allowing US companies a good supply of cheap labor just offshore. As with every poor country, deeper inspection shows the real problem. It isn't the lack of wealth, it's that none of it stays in Haiti. So what have we learned today? Haiti remains an example of the naked face of colonialism, imperialism, and capitalism. A story replicated 100 times over across the globe, from Bangladesh to Kenya, Libya, Peru, and the Philippines. The same processes that enrich the wealthiest segments in your country at your expense operate internationally to do to Haiti what they do to dozens of nations globally. Unrelenting and unending exploitation that only ever ends with proper political organization, economic sovereignty, and military and security independence. That's why every revolution is crushed, and every genuine political alternative is ruthlessly fought against. Haiti is the prototypical example of the capitalist failed state. Remember, when anyone points to you about the supposed failures of socialism, mythical I might add, ask them, where is the success of capitalism in Africa, Asia, and Latin America? The tides are turning. A better world is possible. That's all for this time. If you enjoy what I do, then please consider supporting me on Patreon. It really does help. I'd like to thank my patrons, so thank you too.